Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mahreen Sheila Razvi. I'm an art historian specializing in Mughal art and architecture, particularly of the 17th century, and I work for the Khalili Collection of Islamic Art here in London. I'm delighted today to welcome to this LLF session Dr. Yael Rice, who's an assistant professor of arts and the history of art and Asian languages and civilizations at Amherst College. And she's an expert on Mughal painting, the arts of the book, and portable objects in the Persianate world, particularly from the 15th to the 18th centuries. She contributed an essay to an exhibition held at the Getty Museum in 2018. The exhibition was on Rembrandt and inspirations from India, and Yael contributed a really fantastic essay. And she's here today to speak to us about that topic. So on behalf of LLF, Yael, I'm delighted to welcome you today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mahreen, so much. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just thrilled to be here. I want to thank Razi for the invitation and Iman for coordinating everything seamlessly from behind the scenes. And yeah, let's get started and look at some of the fascinating materials that show a clear, definitive connection between the 17th century Dutch artist Rembrandt and the paintings that were being produced at the Mughal court over the same time and earlier. So wonderful. I'm going to share PowerPoint. Okay. So what we're looking at here on the left is Rembrandt's drawing, probably made, undated, but probably made around 1656 to 61. And on the right, a painting attributed or actually ascribed to the Mughal imperial artist Vichitra, showing a portrait of Shah Jahan. There's much more going on in this composition, but what we can see, the main point of connection, of course, with Rembrandt's own drawing is the figure of Shah Jahan. Now, Rembrandt died in 1669, so he actually executed the drawing on the left towards the end of his life, and it's one of 23 works that are extant that he made inspired by Mughal paintings. And what's absolutely clear and evident is that these were not just sort of inspired by his own fantasy, but that he was looking at Mughal paintings in the flesh. With the exception of two paintings, and I'll be showing you one of those shortly, we're not entirely sure which Mughal paintings in particular he was looking at. So the example I'm showing you on the right, which lives in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, is not necessarily Rembrandt's source material, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of paintings he would have encountered, and also gives us a sense of how Rembrandt received these works, that he really treated them as material to learn and study from, that his studies did not actually involve explorations in color. His drawings, the 23 that are extant, are all done in a pen, as I've given you here in the slide, pen and brown wash and brown ink. So they're monochromatic. He actually executed them on Asian paper, sometimes specifically Japanese paper, which in Amsterdam, where he was based, was quite expensive and was a luxury import object. So what we're seeing here really in Rembrandt's reception of Mughal paintings, and in this case, a portrait of Shah Jahan, is his interest in these materials as kind of exotic luxury objects from the East, right? And he's actually using, again, expensive Japanese paper for his studies after them, and as opportunities for him to really explore composition and form. And he really seems to attend in large part to the figural compositions. He's not really interested in sort of larger scenes, right? He really homes in on the figures that are the central portion of the larger paintings. He makes some adjustments, as I'll show you shortly. And we can see too how different he approaches his own artistic practice as opposed to what is evident in the example of the Mughal painting on the right, where the artist Batitra is using really a hard line, contour, clear sort of boundaries and defined forms. Rembrandt's hand, of course, on the left in the drawing is much freer. There's a painterly quality to his own execution of his subject. You might be wondering, how did he come to acquire or study from Mughal paintings? And that's an interesting question that has not been conclusively answered. What we know is that a number of materials, objects, luxury objects from South Asia were increasingly traveling to the Netherlands, and especially to Amsterdam, where Rembrandt was based. The Dutch East India Company was established in 1602, and that really accelerated the movement of these goods from east to west. And that's almost certainly, that is through these kinds of commercial flows of exchange that Mughal materials like these paintings traveled to Europe in the 17th century. Now, there is tantalizing evidence from an inventory that Rembrandt himself drew up towards the end of his life in 1656, probably actually to avoid bankruptcy, that he owned what is translated from the Dutch as, quote, curious drawings in miniature. And many scholars have interpreted that to mean that in his possession were Mughal paintings. These must be the curious drawings. Stephanie Schrader, who curated the exhibition that Mehreen referred to several years back, suggests that we should be skeptical of that analysis. And she cautions against assuming that that means that Rembrandt owned Mughal paintings, because in fact, curious drawings had a number of different valences in the 17th century Netherlands. And curious doesn't necessarily mean Indian or Mughal. However, he came to temporarily or acquire or own these materials, he spent a lot of time looking at and studying them. And we can only imagine what doesn't survive, besides the 23 drawings that we are familiar with. Just to give you a sense of the range of materials that Rembrandt was looking at, I'm showing you here, of course, on the right, his own study. That was probably done perhaps after a roundel, something along the lines of what we see on the left. Magnified, of course, this is in fact in the flesh, a very, very small image that lives in the Cleveland Museum of Art, again showing a portrait image of Shah Jahan. And we can see again, I hope, in these details how differently Rembrandt approaches the study of portraiture and the study of form, where the artist, the Mughal artist Hashim on the left, is really interested in kind of minute detail. And again, the hard line, the hard contour, not only of the profile, but even the delineation of the ears, the eyes, and so on. Rembrandt, of course, attends to those features, but he has this much more kind of abbreviated manner of representation. And you really get a sense of a kind of liveliness from his drawings, that he's really kind of responding in a exciting, invigorated manner to his own source material. Now, beyond images of Mughal emperors, especially Shah Jahan, who of course was Rembrandt's own contemporary, it's clear that Rembrandt was looking at portraits of other figures. For example, the Mughal prince Daniel, who died in 1605, the drawing that you see by Rembrandt, actually really a drawing slash painting or sketch on the left, very likely was done after a portrait of Daniel, similar to the one that we see on the right from the Met Museum of Art. And one interesting detail that Stephanie Schrader homes in on in her work on Rembrandt's reception of Mughal paintings is how one, again, minor change that Rembrandt makes is to, as you can see here, to shift the leg of many of these standing figures, or at least one leg outward, right? Where it's actually convention in Mughal portraiture of the 17th century to show the figure, the portrait figure, with both feet kind of facing forward so that they appear stationary and relatively flat. Rembrandt makes that slight adjustment, lending to his studies and of course the figure this greater sense of volume and movement in space. Now, as Mehreen mentioned, I was contributor to the catalog from this exhibition that was staged at the Getty Center in LA in 2018. And it was really a landmark exhibition because Stephanie Schrader was able to gather together all 23 of Rembrandt's drawings. And what she did that was so fascinating was to find Mughal paintings that very much resemble the materials that Rembrandt was studying directly. And one of the revelatory things for me visiting this exhibition, having worked on Mughal painting for a while before that, was to see, and this is a shot from, not my own, but actually from the museum of the installation itself, was to see the scale of Rembrandt's works. So he's not only interested in form, right, line, in terms of what he's drawing from his exemplars, but also scale. And this was not just a one-off. It occurred repeatedly in the 23 extant drawings that he chose to work in a comparable size and scale, that kind of intimate scale of the Mughal painting. Now, I'm showing you here on the right, actually one of only two paintings that we're fairly well convinced that Rembrandt himself worked from. The correspondence between the two is fairly close. But we also know, of course, that the painting you see on the right was in Europe without question, at least by the 18th century. And I'll show you actually, I've given away where it's located, but you'll see even better, more fully, its context. But we can see in Rembrandt's drawing after this Mughal painting, probably made around the 1620s, once again, his attention to form, composition, yet he makes various kinds of adjustments. For one, he's added, or actually, in a sense, kind of deleted the carpet, right? He's adjusted that planar quality of the Mughal painting where we see the background of the carpet in a way kind of tipped upward. Rembrandt's made that adjustment so that instead the carpet or the ground appears to recede into space. You might be wondering, did he add a tree as well? Because there seems to be a tree missing from the composition on the right, although recent scholarship by Aaron Hyman suggests that, in fact, the tree, there was originally a tree here that perhaps was repainted in the 1760s by members of the Habsburg family in Vienna. The story gets even stranger. But back to Rembrandt, these drawings that he made, in some cases, fed into engravings and etchings, prints that he produced. And we can see in this example on the right, his rendition of the Old Testament figure, Ibrahim, entertaining the angels, how he has sort of fully digested his exemplar, his Mughal source material, but of course made numerous alterations in order to fit the composition into a new kind of narrative subject, which of course is an Old Testament one. So I think, you know, across the page, moving from our Mughal case to Rembrandt's drawing to the final print, we could see how actively and excitedly he engaged with these kinds of materials. You know, one question that comes up is, why don't we see more adjustments in these drawings, and what are effect studies? And Stephanie Schrader suggests that in a similar way that he used Japanese paper and other kinds of Asian papers for these drawings in a way to kind of show off their exoticness and luxury factor, that Rembrandt really didn't want to hide his sources, so to speak, right? He makes his own adjustments, pivoting a leg outward, you know, drawing and painting with a more painterly and expressive line. But he wanted to make clear that, you know, he was looking at source material from the East. So he made sure to kind of maintain some quality of the original. So I promised you that I would show you where, in fact, our painting, the Mughal painting of the four mullahs that Rembrandt had studied in the 17th century ended up. And it's here in this fantastic room, the Millionenzimmer in the Schönbrunn Schloss, or castle in Vienna. And this is a room that was assembled ostensibly actually by members of the Habsburg family in the 1760s. And you can see on the right, I'm showing you, if you look closely, these are panels here inset into the walls that bear cut up Mughal, as well as other kinds of Indian paintings, namely Deccani paintings and possibly even paintings from Lucknow and other parts of northern India. And you can see on the left where I've highlighted our four mullahs, and you can see how in this arrangement they've been integrated into this kind of larger fantastical scene, again, at the hands of this royal European family in the 18th century. So this is really to give you a sense of the kind of longer trajectory of Mughal painting, not only to Amsterdam in the 17th century, but of course then to Vienna into the 18th century, and how Mughal paintings continue to circulate, continue to move around and inspire others, right? Inspire other artists, other makers decades after. Now, Rembrandt wasn't the first to, that is the first European to encounter European paintings. In fact, we have earlier cases, including this engraving by Reinhold Elstrack, produced around the 16 teens to 1621, which shows a portrait of Jahangir, the Mughal emperor. This, while it doesn't quite resemble a Mughal painting, and partly because, of course, of the medium, the fact that Elstrack has contextualized the figure of Jahangir in this kind of roundel with ornamental decoration that is distinctively European. But the pose, the iconography itself, very clearly, sorry about that, draws from Mughal paintings, similar to the one I'm showing you on the right, where Jahangir is shown, of course, again, as usual, in profile, with a hawk on his glove. This painting, by the way, lives in the British Museum. And it's a similar portrait type and similar iconography that we see produced in this travel account called Purchas's Pilgrims, that was produced in 5 books around 1625 by Samuel Purchas. And we can see in the engraving reproduced in this printed book that we have the figure of Jahangir, Sultan Khurram, the future Shah Jahan, and then a woman who's identified here as a slave. And it's curious that as we look at the detail that Purchase, or the artist slash engraver who is responsible for making this engraving, calls out the fact that he's looking at Mughal paintings, right? He labels this work at the top, pictures out of the Indian copies made by the Mughal painters. And he, though differently from Rembrandt, similarly attends to the features of these side profile portraits. He's much more interested in their accoutrement, their costume, as compared with Rembrandt. And he goes so far, and this is one of the most fascinating features of this image for me, to reproduce the Persian inscription that must have appeared in this now no longer extant Mughal painting. And that is the inscription we see in the bottom right-hand corner that was likely penned in Jahangir's own hand. And we know that not only because of the appearance of the script of the hand itself, which resembles Jahangir's hand, but because it's written in the first person. And it actually testifies to the fact that this work was painted by the royal artist Manohar in Mandu, in the town of Mandu, in 1026, around 1616 AD, when I, that is Jahangir, was in my 50th year. So we have, in fact, this example that long predates Rembrandt, in this case coming from England, that testifies to an earlier European encounter with Mughal portraiture in particular, and specifically Mughal paintings. Now, Rembrandt, Elstrack, and Purchase, however, were not the only ones engaging in this kind of trans-cultural experimentation and drawing from foreign works of art. Mughal artists had been doing that for decades prior. From at least the 1550s, we have evidence that European prints were being collected at the Mughal court. Not only were they being collected, but they were being assiduously studied and copied, as this fantastic example you see on the right, signed by the artist Abul Hassan. He supposedly produced this as a teenager, so he was very precocious. And here we're seeing a study of his after a print, an engraving from the Passion series by Albrecht Dürer, right? And I've kind of pulled out the detail of St. John the Evangelist, who is the figure that Abul Hassan has reproduced here on the right. And I want you in particular to take note of the fact that what seems to really interest Abul Hassan is Albrecht Dürer's use of line. And of course, engraving is a line-based medium. Abul Hassan, however, doesn't reproduce the hatch marks, right, that we see, for example, here. Instead, he is using sort of more minute, detailed application of ink to produce the effect of shading, of modeling. But he's clearly drawn to the kind of dynamism and complexity, really, of the pose that Dürer effects in his representation of John the Evangelist here. This is one of many examples I can show you. The image that you see on the left, that's actually ascribed to a female artist, Neena, who must have worked at the Mughal court in the early 17th century, possibly the daughter or sister of a Mughal painter, is a practically one-to-one rendition of this print on the right by the Netherlandish artist Jerome Wierix. And what's so striking to me is that Wierix completed this print around 1600, meaning that it must have traveled to the Mughal court very shortly after, because Neena then executed her colorized version just a short while later. You might be wondering, how did prints end up in Mughal India? Well, one of the major routes of transmission, of course, were the Jesuits, right? This Catholic missionaries who had set up in Goa early in the 16th century, and of course had been invited by the Mughal Emperor Akbar in 1580 to take up residence at his court. The Jesuits, however, weren't the only ones bringing European prints to South Asia. We have records of merchants, diplomats, and others. And certainly by the early 17th century, these materials appear to be entering into the Mughal sphere in greater and greater volumes. And we can see right in the center of the Mughal court, in the Imperial Manuscript Workshop, artists closely studying these works, yet making their own adjustments, right? Just as Neena colorized Wierix's print, she doesn't bother to copy the inscription that we see at the bottom of Wierix's engraving. Instead, when her painting was mounted on this album page, a panel of Persian calligraphy, a poetic specimen, was added instead. In this further example, probably from the late 16th century, a Mughal artist, perhaps Keshav Das, seems to have been also studying prints by the Dutch artist Goltzius. However, I have not been able to find a precise match, meaning that in this case, the Mughal artist did not copy his source material one-to-one, but seems to have drawn from two different prints by Goltzius that we see illustrated here, not only colorizing them, but in a sense, kind of merging them together to create an entirely new sort of work. So what I want to emphasize here is that what Rembrandt was doing during the later 1650s, early 1660s, his experimentation and adaptation of Mughal paintings was already happening on the Mughal side, already at the end of the 16th century and prior. And one of the most fascinating instances of this is this example of the Mughal artist Abul Hassan's painting over of a European engraving. And I'll show you the engraving in just a moment. But just to repeat, this is a painting done over a European print. In a sense, Abul Hassan is treating the print sort of like a coloring book, but really in Mughal terms, he's treating it as an underdrawing, right? So the very method, the practice of making paintings in the Mughal atelier involved first creating an underdrawing, which would serve as the guide for coloring. And so Abul Hassan, again, is treating this print as his kind of underdrawing. He makes some adjustments, as we'll see. And namely, as you can see here, are a dedicatory inscription that he's included here in Persian, of course, to his patron Shah Selim, who of course will be the future Jahangir emperor. And he adds his own signature here. And what's thrilling to me about this is that he adds it, in fact, next to the name of the designer of the print. This is a print that was actually, as you can see here, executed by Raphael Seidler, and you can see his name here, after a design made by Martin de Vos. And it's Martin de Vos's name that Abul Hassan appends his name next to. You can see now, I think, looking at Abul Hassan's rendition as painted print next to the original print, some of the changes that he's made, namely the adjustment of the rabbit's head. Okay, so the rabbit now looks kind of out of the composition rather than looking back. And he's also adjusted the scale of this large bird such that we now only see a small group of smaller birds. I can't explain why he made these kinds of adjustments, but to me, they speak to the ways that Mughal artists are not just slavishly copying European source materials, but really studying them, digesting them, and trying to make something quite new. And finally, in this example of yet another painted print, from a little bit later, we can see that the artist, I'm again showing you our kind of source material on the right, which is an engraving, a print of Francois of Valois, who was the Dauphin, the son of the French king, Francis I, that the Mughal artist here on the left has painted over this work, not using a lot of color. He uses some tints. There's a kind of pink color to the lips and a flesh color to the face, but he actually maintains the somewhat monochromatic appearance of the print. But notice how he's added a whole context around the print that was not there before. That includes the addition of the lion in the lamb, which is a motif, right? The predator and the prey that has a long history in Islamic hate representation, but of course was also known in a biblical context in the European sphere. And of course, at the top, the addition of these cherubim, which almost certainly were drawn from European images. So there's an interesting kind of synthesis that's occurring. Note too how the Mughal artist has extended the hair of the Dauphin and also colored in the face as if to make the Dauphin appear as a Mughal prince, right? He's become Mughalized here. Why is he doing this? One suggestion is that these kinds of images were not just made for the pleasure of the emperor's consumption, but they were really intended to advance this notion that the Mughal emperors, the whole dynasty, that they were more than just rulers of South Asia, but that they were universal rulers, right? They were rulers of the earthly and spiritual realms. So perhaps we can read in this image then these kinds of universalist aspirations, as if even the prince, this Dauphin of France, is kind of part of the Mughal lineage, or that the Mughal emperors are kind of part of a larger family of royalty that extends to Europe. I just want to close here by bringing us full circle. I want to remind us that the paintings I've been showing you, the Mughal paintings I've been showing you, both the ones done after European prints, but also the portraits, like this portrait of Shah Jahan, they were made for mounting in albums. I'm showing you an unusual example of a surviving intact album, a Mughal album on the left. It gives you a sense of what these objects look like. They were usually formed into stitched books, or took the form of a codex. These kinds of images, like we see here, along with calligraphies, drawings, and even European engravings, were pasted into these books in all kinds of interesting and creative ways. And these books, these albums, what are known in Arabic as muraka, meaning mended or patched, were really central to the cultivation of a sense of belonging at the Mughal court, at the same time that they were a way for patrons to communicate, again, their worldly aspirations, among other kinds of messages and intentions. I bring us full circle in the sense that it's absolutely clear that Rembrandt was not only looking at Mughal paintings, but he was looking at Mughal paintings in a Mughal album, or which were certainly made for a Mughal album. And this might be surprising to many. How is it that a Mughal album or pages from a Mughal album could have traveled to Europe in the 17th century? Well, we have, of course, again, the VOC connection, that is the Dutch East India Company connection, where we have many more goods, people, ideas moving east and west, in particular between South Asia and the Netherlands. But I would argue that the album itself, the Mughal album, because of its universalist aspirations and ambitions, part of the goal was really to get these albums out into the world. And the fact that Rembrandt, one of the most important artist entrepreneurs of Europe in the 17th century, came into possession of one of these albums points to the fact that, in a way, the Mughals' goals were met, right? Here we have Rembrandt studying Mughal paintings. It's quite remarkable. But we've come full circle in another sense too, because of course, the very paintings that Rembrandt was studying had already encountered Europe. And we can see that here in, again, the painting on the right of Shah Jahan, where we see the angels descending from the heavens to bring a crown to him. So in fact, what Rembrandt was looking at was not just objects from the East, they were objects of the East, from the East, that had already encountered the West. I'll stop there, Mehreen, because I think I've been talking longer than I had intended.
Thank you so much, Yael. I would be very happy for you to just continue talking, because that was so interesting and so fascinating. So for everybody listening, Yael and I are going to have a little bit of a discussion now, and then we'll take some questions as well. So one of the questions, or one of the ideas that kept on coming up throughout your presentation, which you then touched on at the very end, was the question of how Rembrandt got these images. Because obviously, when we talk about Mughal painting, when we talk about the albums, and especially items which are in the royal collection, in the royal treasury, the question is always access. Who had them? Who was able to see them? And we know that visitors to the Mughal courts, including Europeans, they did see these albums and see these images. And I was really struck by the fact that some of the drawings and the sketches that Rembrandt makes, they're so close to imperial portraits, which would have been made for imperial albums at the court. So it's not just the idea that you have artists who are making images and then somehow they're getting dispersed, but these are proper imperial images. And the fact that they are leaving the Mughal realm somehow, and that Rembrandt is seeing them, that it's really fascinating, and it is perplexing, because some of the ideas running through my head were, Europeans who were there, European artists who were there, were they making copies? Were they making pounces or, sketches? Because the other point you made at the very beginning about the scale of Rembrandt's drawings in relation to the Mughal paintings, and how they are very, to scale with each other, it just brought up in my mind all these questions about how he actually had access to this material. If you want to comment on that a bit more.
That's such a great question, and I have to say that this has perplexed scholars of Mughal painting, because the notion that imperial paintings could have ended up in Amsterdam by the 1650s just seems anathema, right, to what we have historically understood or thought we understood about the use of Mughal paintings and albums, right?
Well, and also especially because some of these are paintings produced very much during Shah Jahan's reign, very close to the time period in which then Rembrandt is seeing them. So that adds this whole other layer of, really intrigued to how he actually got these images.
Yeah, I liken it not as a real technical term, but it's almost like a tweet, right? The minimal lag time between the production of, say, the portrait of Shah Jahan and then Rembrandt's drawing after it is extraordinary. It really blows my mind. I think this is an opportunity for us to reevaluate our assumptions about how Mughal albums and paintings were used at the Mughal court. And I think for a long time, we have assumed that they were kept, you know, kind of hermetically sealed in a treasury, taken out for very special occasions, et cetera. But Mehreen, as you mentioned, and you've written about, of course, Sir Thomas Roe, who was ambassador to the Mughal court during Jahangir's reign, and how he encountered and was given Mughal paintings. It's clear that they were, that is, the paintings themselves were part of the production of diplomacy between Europeans and Mughal agents. That paintings were gifted, right? As far as whole albums, we don't have the firm evidence and testimony, right? It's certainly not that from the 1650s, but the fact is that by the 1630s, the production of Mughal albums at the Mughal court explodes, right? And of course, we know this from the surviving album pages that now reside in various collections around the world. No longer, of course, in their original 17th century instantiations, because later collectors in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries rearranged them and did all kinds of other things to these materials. But I'm now starting to sense that there was an explosion of album materials. That album materials increasingly were centered not only in terms of being objects of exchange, but that they played an integral part in majlises and in gatherings for entertainment, for performance. And the other important factor to consider is the movement of artists themselves. That we know that, of course, Mughal artists or artists who were working at the Mughal court traveled to workshops in Rajasthan, in the Deccan, and elsewhere in the later 17th century, and that some of them must have were in possession of imperial Mughal paintings. For example, in these workshops in Golconda, where they're producing untold numbers of portrait albums that include portraits of the Mughal emperors. And in those cases, those paintings are modeled after Mughal paintings. And you raised this issue of pounces, of tracings, and that almost certainly was one of the primary means that these materials were actually copied. I don't know if part of your question is perhaps a suggestion that what Rembrandt was looking at were copies of Mughal paintings.
I do wonder, because then it's quite interesting, because you've got the one of Daniel in the imperial album, definitely by one of the high-ranking imperial artists. The version that Rembrandt does is so similar. It's not only that he kind of, fine, he tweaks the physical attributes a little bit, but just the way the hand is placed on the at his waist, the costume. I mean, I always forget what you call the little points at the end of the jama. I mean, he's definitely looking at that particular image, but then did he have that actual image, or did he have a copy of it? Did he have a pounce of it? Because then also we've got the paintings which end up at the Schönbrunn Palace, which, unless you see them close up, it's hard to tell, but are they of the same quality as these imperial paintings? They don't look like they are.
Well, they're not. You're right. You're absolutely right. And the Schönbrunn Palace is an interesting whole other can of worms, because we have evidence of both 17th century Mughal paintings. There are Deccani paintings. There are almost certainly early 18th century paintings from Awadh, possibly Bengal. And then we have the additions of paint that were made by the members of the Habsburg family when this room bizarrely was put together in the 1760s.
It's such a fascinating space.
It's utterly bizarre and fascinating. And I should mention, I don't know if I did say this earlier, but the original kind of collaged, synthesized panels of paintings are no longer up on the walls. There are essentially photographs or substitutes. They're now kept safely in storage for conservation purposes. Well, one thing I will say, in the case of that portrait of Daniel, you're right. We should be skeptical of this notion that Rembrandt was looking at that precise image that is now housed in the Met Museum. But I have come across numerous representations, as I'm sure you have, Maureen, of that very same composition of the prince. So we have to bear in mind too that the practices of copying and of emulating designs was, of course, central to what Mughal painters had been doing already, right? And so that is precisely the way that they're generating not only single figure portraits, but also group portraits by taking pounces or tracings and essentially kind of stitching them together to create new works. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the main conundrum is, you know, what exactly was he looking at? We don't know, except in the case, you know, possibly these two paintings that appear now or were mounted in the Schönbrunn Palace, Millionenzimmer. But I believe he was looking at iterations of these works that in the 1630s and 40s, as the production of albums at the Mughal court and kind of surrounding princelings' courts and governors' courts, where everyone basically wants albums, that, you know, these images of Daniel could be sort of produced en masse, you know, and it's in a way a kind of testimony to what reproduction looks like, sort of parallel to the rise of reproductive print in Europe. So yeah, it's a problem, but it really speaks to, in fact, the prodigious numbers of copies of these works that were made at the Mughal court alone.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point.
Yeah. I do think, by the way, you know, I touched upon this other factor, which are these workshops in Golconda, near, you know, today's Hyderabad in India, where for a short period of time, these portrait albums were being produced that included portraits of the Mughal emperors, portraits of Shivaji, portraits of Deccani rulers, and so on. And they very, very closely resembled each other. And this is based on the work, actually, recent work of Marta Beccarini, the artists, and we don't know actually if they were royal or commercial artists. Those artists working in Golconda were also working from tracings. And so they are, in an analog sense, reproducing. And as I'm sure you know, those albums now, which seem to have been made expressly for agents of the Dutch East India Company for European consumption, now are scattered all over Europe and North America. And, you know, practically every major library collection, institutional collection, has one of these Golconda albums.
The inevitable afterlife of these manuscripts and albums.
Yeah, and yeah, they keep going and going and going.
Yeah. I just want to have another kind of little chat about the other aspect of what you were talking about, and then we'll take some questions. The Mughal artists who are looking at the European material, because that's obviously such a fascinating area in and of itself. And you showed one of my absolute favorites, which is the sketch that Abul Hassan did of St. John. And I remember seeing it for the first time at the Ashmolean, and I was amazed at the size of it, because you read the dimensions. So for those of you who don't know, it's quite small. And seeing it and the scale of it and how just exquisite it is, it was so yeah, just completely blew me away.
Mm.
And as you say, we have examples where we can see that the Mughal artists as well are using tracings or pounces to make, practically a like-for-like image. But then we also have the other examples where they are interpreting and making a freehand version of the European prints that they were, looking. And it's quite fascinating to me how integral the royal patrons were to that process, that it was the interests of Akbar and then Prince Salim and the other royals, and the fact that they were so fascinated by this imagery that they were having their artists look to it and copy it. And it's just, it had such an incredible impact on Mughal painting as a genre, just so, so seminal to what actually happened.
Yeah, it's curious that I think you've really kind of hit the nail on the head that in particular during the reign of Akbar, 1556 to 1605, Europe is a small part of, it's a small figure, it seems, in the larger kind of Mughal imaginaire. Of course, the Jesuits are present you have this missionary or Jesuit mission at the court. And there are various contacts with Europeans, but they don't necessarily seem to loom that largely. We get a different impression from the artistic record, although I'd say it's somewhat skewed, right? What we're not looking at are the hundreds of manuscript paintings and other kinds of album paintings that don't clearly or evidently have any connection with European works or Europe at all. But there, what drives that fascination has, of course, been an abiding question for scholars, right? What is the goal here? And what's curious to me is that at Muslim courts historically, manuscript workshops in terms of sort of exotica tended to home in on, and I'm talking about 15th and 14th centuries, namely the Ilkhanid and the Mongol courts of Iran, and then the Timurid courts. The exotic was really China.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So it's the East, it's the Chini. At the Mughal court in the 16th century, there is a kind of flip where it's the Farangi, it's the Rumi, it's the European that becomes the sort of main or one of the primary planets in their constellation. I mean, the East or China doesn't drop out entirely, but where we find these kinds of tropes, especially literary tropes that compare the masters of painting to Chinese artists. At Akbar's court, it's the European artists who are supposedly producing the most fascinating and magical works. So we're seeing a kind of, I think, not to put it too simply, but a sort of flip in orientation from perhaps a sort of Eurasian sphere to a more westward looking sphere, at least as far as what we can tell from this this driving interest in European works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if that in a way had to do with the novelty of it at the time, because obviously you have that Central Asian Persianate impact from the Mughal heritage. So they've seen that impact coming from the East, they've seen that impact coming from China. And now they have this new kind of novel material, which is showing up at their courts, in their realm, and then at their courts, with the arrival of, first the Jesuits and then the other European, countries as well. And I wonder if that is part of that, driving factor for why, because now it's new and it's interesting and it's, it hasn't been kind of done like the influences coming from China have been.
That could very well be the case. That could very well be the case. It's always been striking to me that in the albums that are, I should say album pages, because they don't actually survive as whole albums, that are assembled at the end of the 16th, early 17th centuries. And I didn't show an example of this, but they also contain European prints, right? As well as the paintings done after European prints. What they don't contain are specimens of Rajput painting or earlier contemporary painting, what we call the Charapantasika style. So exactly the kinds of paintings that were being produced in the very region where the Mughals set up their courts. So as much as they're sort of orienting themselves seemingly to this sort of broader global perspective, they're editing out and kind of rejecting, even though, of course, many of those artists who had been trained in those styles are working in their workshop. But they don't seem to be collecting, they're not collecting, specimens of paintings from from Bhagavata Puranas that, of course, ostensibly might have been made available to them or they would have had in their possession. And so there's also rejection that's happening. And I'm just going to share my screen quickly again, but just to go back to that fantastic study by Abul Hassan, I've argued previously that one of the appeals of European prints to Mughal patrons and artists was their graphic quality. And, in particular, their monochromatic appearance, their construction through sort of methods of producing line. And we see that, I think, in Abul Hassan's own study. And I didn't bring an example here, but there had been a long-standing appreciation for black pen, what are called Sia Kalam compositions, that of course predate the Mughals. Which isn't to say that they weren't also interested in the kinds of forms, the attention to modeling, the articulation of pose and body. But I think too that there was a kind of appeal for these works that seem to resemble this long-standing tradition, right? The Sia Kalam tradition, not to mention the fact of the calligraphies that comprise usually about 50% of these albums that are, of course, line-based and largely monochromatic with, of course, exceptions. But yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, it's one of the reasons we love what we do.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I think we are almost out of time, Yael, but we've got time for one question. So somebody has asked, what does the copying of European prince at the rebel court of Selim tell us about him as a rebelling prince? Was there a particular image of himself he was putting forth through these paintings in order to strengthen his candidacy to the Mughal throne?
That's such a great question.
Yeah.
So those of you in the audience who are not aware of this, but Selim, the future Emperor Jahangir, sent up a rebel court in Allahabad in the early 17th century, where he rebelled against Akbar. Of course, he would eventually succeed his father when Akbar died, so he was heir to the throne. But he did attempt to usurp Akbar's authority and power. And remarkably, recent scholarship, especially by Milo Beach, has established that many of the artists who ended up working at Selim's court in Allahabad were longstanding members of Akbar's own workshop. So they actually, whether they just saw the stars, they knew, where this was going. And so then acted accordingly or not. But many of these artists had already, they were essentially kind of the long-standing figures who had been trained in Akbar's workshop in the 1580s and the 1590s. So presumably they brought materials with them, right? Jahangir seemed to have a particular interest in European images and in prints. And again, I would say that, you know, what is he going for? What are these artists trying to do? At the very least, to construct a notion of their patron as a world ruling emperor, right? And that's, of course, you know, part of his proclamation that he is ruler of, you know, the earthly world, right, and the spiritual world, and that, you know, his status as such precludes him necessarily affiliating himself only with sort of Turkic and Persianate forms of representation, that essentially Europe is available to him as well. And I think increasingly into the 17th century, and especially with his successor Shah Jahan, they see Europe and the West as, you know, part of their kind of intended audience for these kinds of messages.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
But it's a really, really good question.
No, it's a great question. And I will say as well that in terms of the imagery which is being produced while Salim is at Allahabad, there is one particular portrait which he has produced at that time, in which he is seated on this incredible throne, and it's a full-page portrait just of him. And it is one of the most regal, royal images produced up until that time at the Mughal court. It's by far and away more imperial than anything Akbar ever had produced of himself. And Salim has this made as a prince when he's proclaiming himself as a Shah, as a ruler. So he very much understands the use of imagery in projecting this imperial authority that he's claiming even while his father is alive. And if you want to see that painting, if you go to LLF's YouTube channel and you look up the talk that I did with William Dalrymple and Audrey Trush in February of this year, that particular painting is visible there. So do take a look at it, because it is absolutely amazing.
It's a really good one. And you're so right that Jahangir is really the one who, you know, obviously his artists are the ones who do it, but it's through his patronage that we see the development of really the imperial portrait.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think it can be argued by anyone that he's not the driving force behind what we come to associate with the imperial portrait.
That's right.
Great. All right, on that note, Yael, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a fantastic presentation. It's been so lovely talking about all these things with you. I could go on for hours more just talking with you about it all, but unfortunately we have to end. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Mehreen. I've really enjoyed it too.
Take care. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.